Hello and welcome to Trusty Chords, the podcast which aims to celebrate music and those that create it. If you're someone who hasn't yet listened to Propagandhi, then I'm sure you're about to have the time of your life as you discover their eclectic and celebrated discography. Forming in Canada back in 1986, they've been a going concern for close to 4 decades now, but it wasn't until 1993 that they released their first album. After a few years, they released 2001's Today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes, which is often considered to be a seminal record in the world of political punk music. Personally, it's an album that I fell in love with thanks to its lyrical focus and high energy intensity, and I've been a fan ever since. But that's not the peak of their career by far, because as the years have gone on, Propagandhi have occasionally returned with a new record, reminding us of just how amazing and important their work is. This year, they returned with At Peace, their 8th record and their first in as many years. Needless to say, it's a special moment for punk fans the world over when Propagandhi returns. This week, I was lucky enough to have a wonderful chat with the group's vocalist and guitarist, the legendary Chris Hanna. For someone as ferocious as Chris is on the live stage, it's hard to imagine someone as reserved, thoughtful, and wonderful as a guest, and I'm truly grateful for him to join the podcast. Anyway, have a listen to Propagandhi's At Peace, cross your fingers for their live return, have a listen to our chat, and I'll see you at the end of the episode for some general housekeeping. Chris Hanna, thank you very much for joining this episode of Trusty Chords.
Tyler, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining me. So, for those who don't recognize your name, could you give me a quick few words on who you are and why we're chatting today?
Oh, well, I'm a guy from Canada, and I'm in a band that hovers somewhere between a punk band and a metal band, and it's called Propagandhi, and we've been around for quite a long time, the bulk of my life. And yeah, we've sort of lived in the musical margins for the entirety of our existence, but we're pretty comfortable there.
That's a nice way to sort of put it, I guess. I probably couldn't have done it any better. But I guess before we talk about your life in those musical margins, what I love to do is actually go back to the start of things. And I always love to ask, do you have a recollection of your earliest memory of when music first resonated with you?
Um, Sort of. It's interesting because I lived for 9 months in Australia when I was 4 or 5, and at that time, for some reason, my dad had acquired a cassette player. I don't know how new they were to technology wise back then, but it was very new to me. And um, because at the time in Australia, I'm sure globally, but it really stuck out to me as an Australian thing at the time. My sister was really into ABBA, and my mom was really into Neil Diamond, and my sense was that Australia was very much into both ABBA and Neil Diamond in 1974, 1975, and so I heard a lot of ABBA and Neil Diamond, and I think it. I don't think I was born a very musical person, but I think just the listening habits of my sister and my mom. I'm pinpointing this one time in Australia. This continued throughout the years of my sister listening to Prince and Bon Jovi and everything through the wall. At the time as a teenager, I was a metalhead. I'd be like plugging my ears, but ultimately I really came to appreciate all the kind of music she was listening to that was outside of my wheelhouse, my metallic realm. And yeah, but yeah, the experience in Australia is sort of the formative um, origin story memory of realizing music existed and that it was interesting despite me feeling like I didn't have a place in music.
One of my favorite things is actually speaking to folks like yourself who are known for genres which is so different to those sort of early musical memories. Like, I feel like Neil Diamond and ABBA is so different to what Propagandhi plays.
Yeah.
So I guess that musical journey, I mean, that obviously would have evolved over the years. So what was it that sort of, I guess I should ask, what were some of those sort of like stepping stones that led to you sort of playing music? Like what other artists sort of came to you and then said, hey, this is a world that I want to get into?
Well, it was Venom from Newcastle, England.
Mm.
Um, a somewhat legendary and infamous band that started arguably the entire black metal movement. It was a very different black metal movement in the early '80s. It was much more humorous, much more like had was more like Van Halen than say the 90s Norwegian kind of stuff. But Van Halen in spirit, not in music. Um, and but it was the first time I heard music that, like, to me, when I first heard Venom's first LP, Welcome to Hell, I was like, oh my God. But first of all, I thought, is there something wrong with this cassette player? It just sounded like mayhem. Didn't sound like music. And then as I listened on, I felt like, okay, well, there's bands like Judas Priest and Def Leppard and Twisted Sister that were big at the time. They seemed like beyond reach in terms of the average person who listens to music. Like I couldn't do that. But when I heard Venom, I was like, I think I could do that. It was like the democratization of music moment for me. It was like anybody is allowed to make music. If these three guys from Newcastle can make a record, anybody can. And so I found that, in retrospect, it was very empowering. And and it's what kind of led me to like picking up a guitar and and immersing myself in the subculture of early and mid 80s thrash metal.
There's something really magical about when music feels accessible and it feels like you can do it. Like I always feel the same way when I hear like a really well written song and I'm just sort of like, oh, that feels so inaccessible. But then you actually like break it down. You're like, actually, this is really simplistic. And it
Right.
inspires you to actually say, hey, I could try this. I could be on the same level.
Mhm.
And I feel like there's probably a lot of people who say they could never be on the same level as Propagandhi, which is my nice little sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Compliment to go into my next question of how did Propagandhi actually first sort of like come to be? Like, what was the initial plan when the band first formed? Were you sort of thinking, let's have fun, or were you thinking, let's try and take over the world musically?
Oh no, it was purely just like um youthful enthusiasm, youthful folly, and wanting to, having discovered that anyone is allowed to make music, even people who were born with zero musical inclinations. That was it seemed like an interesting experiment, and my friend Jord, who is our drummer, was having the same experience um, with drums, and we thought we would just let's let's do this together. And honestly, the original impetus for the band when it got a little more serious was just to um, sort of be the peanut gallery of the music scene in Winnipeg, sort of like this. Who are those two guys on the Muppet Show who sit up in the balcony?
Oh, Statler and
Uh,
Waldorf.
yeah, it was kind of
Yeah.
to be like a really um, critical, negative uh, Stetler and Waldorf to the music scene that existed in Winnipeg at the time. Um, why? I'm not sure why. Probably we gravitated towards the punk scene because we felt it was somewhere um, you went when you didn't feel like you were a part of everything else that was happening in the world, the mainstream. And when we got there, we discovered all the same hierarchies and sort of um, social games. The same things were played in the punk scene, and we were like sort of discouraged by that. So we decided to set our sights on that kind of thing. And I mean, not in like some sort of like this is going to be our life. It was just, we thought we're going to play some bar shows and piss people off, just be, a bar band. And then and once it somehow took off as something people were interested in, we sort of, um, I suppose, took it a little more seriously as time went on.
I guess in terms of taking things seriously as time goes on, like I think it was around the time of like today's empires, tomorrow's ashes, that everyone sort of starts viewing Propagandhi as a little bit more of an overtly political band and having like a lot more to say. But I guess how do you sort of view the band's evolution? Do you sort of look at it as like, that was a bit of a turning point, or do you sort of feel like you've always sort of had these things to say and you've just sort of refined the way that you sort of say them and convey them with the audience?
Yeah, I think from early on, that was part of our interest in the whole thing was um, learning about the world, trying to see the world through different lenses, not just the ones that were either foisted on us or that we were used to, which were largely mainstream perspectives about the world. And once we started to discover them, and not in every case, but in some cases, we would hold up these more marginal perspectives and compare it to the mainstream perspective. And it was clear to us some mainstream perspectives were utter bullshit. So that sort of snowballed. And yeah, it was like our first record, most of those songs were written when I was a teenager, and they're sort of they reflect like a angsty teenager diary sort of thing. All this sort of toilet humor and kind of stuff that was on the record too. But there was like all the elements of uh, of where we're finally at today with the band. They're in there somewhere. It's just that it's such a young version of it that it's hard to take it seriously. Not that anybody has to take what we do now seriously, but we feel um, I mean, I'm not particularly embarrassed of our latest record, whereas I'm pretty embarrassed by our first record. So
It's understandable. I mean, actually, I should say that the way I said that's understandable. That's not me saying you should be, Chris. That's just me sort of saying, like, I understand how, in hindsight, in evolution, sort of comes into play there. Before I do touch on the new album, I think one thing I always really do love about Propagandhi and the albums that come out is that your discography is very, for lack of a better word, economical. There's plenty of times between releases. You're not oversaturating the market with like how so many bands can, and everything feels so much more considered. There's a lot of time, a lot of care taken. But lifting the curtain, I mean, is that the reason there is so much time between records? Like, is it a case of ensuring you're putting out the best material possible rather than sort of providing a snapshot of a band at a certain era?
it is definitely, I mean, taking our time to be sure about some things is a component, but it's part of it is also the challenges we face, um, our own limitations at our instruments, our own like I said earlier, none of us are natural born musicians. It hasn't come to us um, naturally, and everything we've kind of ever done with the band has been through sheer perseverance. And that sometimes means it's going to take us twice or three times as long as other people who have a facility with music or a facility with their instruments where it comes. Like I know so many musicians just here in Winnipeg, they write songs all the time, every day, and they're good at it, and it just happens for them. It's like you can tell it's like this person was born to play guitar and write songs. I wasn't. So um it's quite a challenge for us to understand how to arrange a song to satisfy our own sense of aesthetic, or our own sense of the story arc, um or our own sense of sonics. It takes us probably, I would probably guess, at least twice as long as everybody else just to do that. Um, but like you say, the other component is we give it a lot of consideration, and we try not to write anything that at some point doesn't feel like it's the best song you ever wrote, even if it ends up at the end of the day like, that one didn't really land the way I thought it would. Now that it's been out in the world for 6 months, but we really approach every song like every song should be just like an exhilarating experience making it, even if it ultimately kind of fails. So it just takes more time for us to get that feeling.
Plus, there is also the added benefit, I guess, that because like there is a lot of time taken, everyone feels like, oh, a new Propaganda album. We really have to appreciate it because who knows when the next one's going to be coming along, and everyone
Yeah,
really gets into it.
maybe that's part of it too. Like the success of the records or the band or whatever is that it's not delivered, it's not hand delivered to people on a guaranteed schedule. It's you never know what's
Mm.
when it's coming, or if it's coming at all. So yeah, maybe that gives us an unfair advantage in terms of people focusing on it for at least a short amount of time.
Well, that actually serves a nice little segue because I remember when Victory Lap came out, my first thought was, well, Victory Lap, that almost sounds like it's like a sense of finality about it. And I'm sort of like, is this going to be the last time we hear a Propaganda album? But thankfully, 8 years later, we are at peace because we have received a new album called At Peace. It's a truly brilliant record, easily a highlight of the year for myself. But
Oh,
look,
wow.
how did it come about? Because a Propaganda record at a time like this feels pertinent, but has it been in the works for quite some while, for quite a while, or is it sort of a little bit more reactionary to the previous years and everything?
Well, a bit of both. Like we always have bits and pieces. Even after a record is like Victory Lap was done, there's bits and pieces that didn't make it, idea wise, music wise, that are sitting there. And it's like they're puzzle pieces on a table, but there's hardly any. There's not enough to put together the puzzle. So we accumulate the bits and pieces as time goes on. And eventually, for us in this case, it was because of the pandemic. The pandemic took 2 years away from putting the puzzle together for us, really. That it took 6.5 years for us to look at the table and say, okay, we have enough pieces. Let's put it together and see what we have. And we bore down on that. Um, sort of, I mean, it's happenstance that the last two records have come out with this, this at these times when this buffoonish authoritarian idiot thug is the is at the reins of the global superpower. And the records were largely conceived and the puzzle put together under the previous administration, which was which itself had presided over the enabling of an ethnic cleansing. And so, it is just happenstance that these are coming out as the living idiot Trump is taking power. But I suppose those happenstances are also sort of uh, like another unfair advantage. It's like this backdrop that just shows up out of nowhere that gives our record, um, maybe it makes it more of a curiosity, given that that backdrop shows up at the same time that the record does.
And I always love to ask a question like this, and I guess you may have sort of touched on it a little bit there, but an album like At Peace, what does it say about who Propaganda are in 2025?
Uh, aging, painfully aging, uh, people who like, you know, think life is beautiful, but that society is not, and trying to figure out how to spend the remainder of our lives in some sort of meaningful way, given that the prospects for um, even a semblance of justice uh, in this world is seems further away than it ever has. How do you exist in that context without either ending up in jail because you do what you think should be done, or you wash your hands of the whole thing and meditate your way to bliss? I don't know. It's I'm not sure what the answer is. I think that's part of the if there's a theme in the record, it's just what do we do? What are we gonna do? Is what's happening on the record.
And it's statements and sort of like thoughts and ruminations like that which make Propaganda one of those bands that I truly admire. It's just
Yeah.
that sort of reasoned, well thought out sort of approach to it all, rather than just a reactionary sort of knee jerk approach and just saying things are bad. It's actually saying things are bad, but this is why things are bad, and there is a sense of hope at the end of the day. And yeah, that's my way of saying I admire what you do, and I'm glad you're doing what you do.
Oh, thanks,
Um,
Tyler.
but as a bit of a final question before we get into the final section, it's also been a little bit of time since we last had you all down in Australia. So should we be expecting a return at some point in the future?
I think so. Yeah, like it's sort of not my wheelhouse to figure out the traveling kind of stuff, but what I've heard so far is there is a very tentative, penciled in plan for next year. So, um, I don't love touring, but I think going to Australia is always a fascinating experience. So it's one thing it's one of the few things I would look forward to on the calendar.
Amazing. Well, let's get down to the portion of the podcast from which its namesake is derived. So, Trusty Chords sees me follow the 1, 3, and 5 structure of a standard chord and ask you about one artist that has impacted you, 3 albums that have been influential, and 5 songs you can turn to. These albums and songs don't need to be by the one artist, and obviously, I am giving you this question with so little notice that it might be a little bit difficult. But allow me to ask the first question, Chris, by saying, who is one artist that has been the most inspirational to you, whether it be personally or creatively?
Wow. You're going to be able to edit this, right?
Absolutely.
So when I have this like 15-minute silence before I figure it
There
out.
is so much silence that has been cut out of these podcasts in the past, so don't you worry.
Um, I wish it was a no-brainer. There is a band from Canada um, called Sacrifice. They're sort of a legendary thrash metal band in Canada. I'm not sure how well known they are outside of Europe and Canada. Um, but I encountered them at a pivotal musical moment in my life. I explained earlier about Venom and Sacrifice were because they were from Canada. It was extra fascinating because most of the bands I consumed through that genre up till that point were either American or European. You know, it was like sort of the Bay Area thrash metal scene. There was Metallica and Exodus, and then from the UK you had Venom, you had Slayer from LA. So while I talked about how democratizing it felt, you know, it gave you license for anyone to play music. At the same time, it still felt far away. But then when I discovered there was this band from Canada, um, who also felt that it's like anyone can do this, we're going to do it, and they started doing it when they were teenagers, and I followed along throughout the years up until like this very last month when they put out their newest record called Volume 6, and they're a better band now than they ever were. And I would also I could apply exactly what I just said about Sacrifice to another Canadian band called Voivod. Bands that just they like the typical story arc of a band is there's a point where they start to suck, like just because you know the ravages of time. But both those bands specifically have continued to inspire me as because they've grown as bands, and not every record has delivered the you know the same expected um aesthetic formula that made them successful in the first place. They built on it, took it somewhere else, and I just find it endlessly inspirational and galvanizing that these guys who are now approaching their early 60s are still able to make this compelling music full of energy without pretending to be teenagers. You know,
Mm.
it's so incredibly um, rare that to my ears that um, bands can be so consistently, even if it's intermittently, they can be so consistently effective at what they do and get better at it over the years. Um, and because it's what we've hoped for and what we've and it's helped us kind of like aim a little higher because look at Sacrifice and Voivod, they fucking still put out a killer record this year. Like we gotta you can't rest on your laurels. You have to push too. And just because we're old and tired and run down doesn't, you know, you still gotta give her.
Oh, well, that's actually made me very excited to actually check out the new Sacrifice album because, admittedly, I'm aware of the band, but I've not kept close tabs on them. So it's very good to know that there's a new album out that I should actually listen to. Um, and my next question for you here, what are the 3 albums that have impacted you the most? This could be albums that you're always throwing on, or something that was integral to musical evolution. And actually, funnily enough, only 2 weeks ago, I actually interviewed someone who actually previously supported Propagandhi in Australia, who picked Supporting Cast as
Oh
their
wow.
most impactful album as well. So
Oh
it's
wow.
very fitting to have you on this podcast now for that.
Oh cool. Well, I think like if I'm thinking in terms of we're talking records, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Like if we're talking in terms of pivotal records. The Venom Welcome to Hell record is absolutely one of them. Um, for all the things that are wrong about that record, as the years have gone on and people's um, intellects have increased in the general public for how you should. Well, I'll leave that part out. I'll just say, I mean, it hasn't necessarily aged well lyrically in a lot of respects, but it was such a pivotal record for me, that has to be one that has to be on the taken account of. Another one, sort of in the same vein. Should I just go on?
Yeah, feel free. Yeah.
Okay. Is MDC, Millions of Dead Cops,
Mhm.
their self titled record, which I encountered just a few years after the Venom record. And it turned my world upside down in terms of how I saw society. I described earlier about eventually actively seeking out marginalized voices and marginalized perspectives and comparing them to the mainstream narrative. The MDC record was the is the origin story of that interest. Like, because my first reaction when I saw the record and read the lyrics was like, what fucking bullshit communist nonsense what is this? I was a very conservative kid who grew up in the in the military, and it's funny because I heard the record at a friend's house, and I was just like, this is bullshit. I'm out of here. And the first thing I did when I left the house was go to the record store and buy the record,
Wow.
because it was just like something about it got to me. And then I sat with the record and was just blown away by. I mean, it's the music on the record is like it's a musical tornado, and in conjunction with the lyrics, it was just something I'd never seen or heard before. And I started to take what they were saying seriously, and I again held up what they were saying about society and what my upbringing was saying about society, and I held them both up to the world around me. And I was like, yeah, mine isn't describing the real world. This MDC record is describing the real world. So so in terms of how I see the world, which in turn became what a lot of the thematic content on the records is, the MDC record is like another huge turning point for me.
I also thoroughly like how you say it's like a musical tornado because I mean it's what 14 songs in like 20 minutes.
It is a
It's
crazy record to this
it's
day.
amazing.
Like, a lot
Yeah,
of that stuff from those days kind of sounds dry and clunky. There's not a lot of the records from that time that really stand the test of time. That one is still somehow musically ahead of the curve, I think.
absolutely. And we have one record left. What would be a third album that was influential?
Um, Probably Bad Brains Eye Against Eye
Mm.
LP, which again I'd never heard anything like it before. And it was, I was told this is a hardcore punk band. And then I got it home and I'm like, wow, this is like all kinds of music jammed into one thing. It was so different from, even the MDC record, which is a musical tornado. The Eye Against Eye record is like, in some ways, it is that, and it's the complete opposite. So I felt like it took me in so many different directions when I sat through it for the first time. And I mean, it was not insignificant that it was made by four African Americans. That was, to me, I had never seen that before in the punk scene, and barely at all in the thrash metal scene. So it was like, okay, what's going on here? Like, what are these guys talking about? And, it, the record, some of the lyrics are like they're a little bit cryptic and hard to parse, but it was one of my first encounters, um, outside, MDC was like the perspective of, say, white punks in living in the US under a police state of some sort. The Bad Brains record, it 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 had woven in its own somewhat more authentic, not necessarily more authentic, but more convincing perspectives of the relationship between Black America and the police. And that was because that record was stayed with me until I heard Public Enemy a few years later. And I was like, okay, it provided a foundation for me to, I think, understand America in a way I hadn't previously. And again, musically, I mean, if you listen to Turnstile's, what was that record called? Glow On or Glow Up?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
A couple of years ago, great record. Like they're the first band that kind of, to me, truly understood the essence and spirit musically of Bad Brains Eye Against Eye, and managed to recreate those musical moments without like seeming like they had just plagiarized this band. I just love that connection between those two records. I thought it was a great record, the Turnstile record as well.
Truly, truly. And lastly, I would love to know the 5 songs you can always turn to, whether it be for comfort, for excitement, anything at all, your 5 trusty songs. And obviously, this is again a difficult question, but in just before we get onto that, as I mentioned before, only a few weeks ago, someone picked Supporting Cast as their favorite album. I also had that same person pick Back to the Motor League as their favorite song.
Oh,
And
wow.
based upon the release of At Peace recently, they also picked Lovers in a Dangerous Time as one of their favorite
Oh,
songs.
wow.
So you've had quite an impact on one of my recent guests.
Wow. Well, that's cool. I would also throw, I mean, I could throw Lovers in a Dangerous Time. In fact, the whole Bruce Cockburn LP that song is from is a pretty interesting record, especially here in Canada. It was a big deal when it came out, and a lot of the themes on that record, I think, dovetail with some questions we've asked through our band as time has gone on. So I'll pick that record and that song as well, just to get one out of the way.
It's a nice little segue into the section, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll pick the Supremes' "You Can't Hurry Love," with an honorable mention to the Phil Collins version, because that was the one I encountered first, and I know it's much maligned by people, but I think it's excellent. And the Supremes version is just like lightning in a bottle to my ears. I would pick the song "As the World Burns" by Sacrifice from their Soldiers of Misfortune LP. What's that? Is that 3 now?
That's 3, yes.
Steve Earle, "Christmas Time in Washington," I think it's from his El Corazon LP. I find that comforting. And because this is Australian, I will pick "Midnight Oil, Beds Are Burning."
Wonderful.
That was pretty pivotal for me as well in my musical development. So, yeah.
That's wonderful, and actually, also very funnily, when I mentioned I had this one guest of mine. The guest was Jesse Coulter, who was previously of the band Stolen Youth, who supported you guys.
Oh,
during,
yeah, okay, yeah.
Who was also in the band with Matt Horvath, who's a huge Propagandhi fan and the biggest Propagandhi fan I've ever met. But he also picked a Midnight Oil song as well. So you're very clearly in fine company. It's some very nice choices you picked today, Chris.
Which song did he pick? Which Midnight Oil song?
He picked a Dream World.
Oh, that's a great one too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, everyone's picking some great answers. So everyone's a winner when it comes to the Trusty Chords podcast. But look, Chris, I want to say thank you so very much for your time today and for being such a wonderful guest. It was a true pleasure to have a chat to you at long last. And thank you so much for being part of the Trusty Chords podcast.
Well, cheers, Tyler. I really appreciate you having me on here. It was a fun time.
Thank you for listening to Trusty Chords. If you listened to this episode and enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you were able to take a few moments to like, follow, share, and review this podcast on your preferred platform of choice. As always, no obligation, but I'm forever grateful if you do. As always, I'm over on Instagram and Facebook at Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. I've also got a blog on my website, which is tylerjenke.com. That's tylerjenke/Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. That's where you can find a list of all the songs chosen by my guests each week, along with a playlist of all the songs chosen thus far. You can also find a link to the Buy Me a Coffee platform, where you can throw me a few dollars to keep this podcast running, if you feel so inclined. I also need to thank Chris Hanna for spending time with me this week for the podcast, and I need to thank Dave from Diamond Creative for helping to organise the chat as well. But once again, thank you kindly for listening, and I hope to see you all again next week as I continue to celebrate music and those that create it.